It is a pleasure to introduce Rowena Morrow. Rowena is a futurist who, for those of you who've been with us at other Futures Friday, you have met Peter Hayward. If you are in the Futurist Camp class of 2020, you were with Peter Hayward 1 week ago tonight. And Rowena and Peter are partners in Future Shift. Now, some other just very quick, interesting things about Rowena. I mean, I adore her. She believes in many of the same things I do about the future and why we should be hopeful about the future. Unlike me, she actually has a strategy for why hope is a useful strategy, and she's going to share that process with us tonight. We both are subscribers to a brand of toilet paper called Who Gives a Crap. So we were never without loo roll during COVID. True story, look it up, Who Gives a Crap. All their profits go to building toilets in places where toilets need to be built. And then the final thing I just want to mention is, in addition to being a futurist, Rowena has, like, over her career, had these kind of like more intentional, short-term sort of C-suite level responsibilities. And the one she's working on right now is so cool. And for those of you who believe in the circular economy, you're going to love this. She's currently the interim exec at the Waste and Resource Recovery. Is it the center or the institute?
So it's the Grampian Central West. So it's 50,000 square kilometres and 250,000 people in the western part of our state.
Yeah. So she's like, I'm committed to finishing this interim executive directorship, because she's like, what we're doing is too important to not, see through to the end. So with that, Rowena and I are gonna talk a little bit about hope as a strategy. We recommended that you check out the book Sand Talk, which is indigenous. Tyson is indigenous to Australia. And she's going to share some thoughts about that I think are extremely provocative for how we might rethink what it looks like for the future of the world, Australia, the United States, and other countries. So with that, Rowena, welcome aboard.
Thank you. Lovely to be here. Lovely to see everyone. It's fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I was actually considering having you sort of tell your origin story. But then I listened to a podcast interview with Tyson, the author of Sand Talk, and he said, in Aboriginal culture, you would never do that, because I am not a story. I am part of an interconnected whole, and just carving out my part of it feels wrong. So I thought, screw that. I'm not going to do that Western mind thing. I'm going to borrow a page from Tyson's playbook. So, why don't we just start with this big idea, the central idea about hope as a foresight strategy. Some people say hope isn't a strategy. So share your thoughts on that.
I will. And just before I do, something we do in Australia at the beginning of every meeting is to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country in which we're meeting. So I just wanted to do that quickly, I guess, across all the First Nation countries on which we're meeting, and to repay my respects to their leaders, past, present, and emerging. So, I mean, I guess part of that speaks to hope. And the reason we do that here is to, we haven't quite come to terms with our First Nations history here as yet. There's a lot of truth telling and I guess understanding that needs to go on. But as the way I see hope and the way I see how hope and the future intersect is, hope for me is not close your eyes, cross your fingers and wish. It's a robust thinking methodology around setting goals, working out ways to achieve those goals, and generating self-agency. So, saying that is easy from a position of privilege, because for people in a position of privilege, finding agency in systems is, I guess, it is more accessible than for people who are not in a position of privilege. So I guess we need to bound this conversation with that being said. But it seems to be a psychological tool that we all have access to as humans. So this work comes out of actually the University of Kansas. So Professor C.R. Snyder, been doing this work since the 1980s. He's now passed, but for 30 years, he'd been doing research and experiments with people around his theory of hope. and measuring the impacts that people with high hope had on their college outcomes, on their work outcomes, on their health outcomes, and having a high hope disposition, or developing high hope as a way of seeing and being in the world, positively affected your relationships, your health, the way you managed yourself through your life, your ability to come back from stress. So when I fell across hope, it was actually, I was doing my master's in foresight, and I'd been looking, I didn't quite understand how in the foresight realm, we talk a lot about images of the future. So the future's not real, but the future exists, and it exists in images that we either hold individually or as shared images. And I was trying to work out as a new master, you know, as a new student of the field, how on earth you went from holding an idea to actually acting on it. So I was looking for that connection piece between I believe something should be and I'm actually going to do something about it. And when I went looking in the psychological literature, I literally fell across hope theory, which I had the same reaction, Rebecca. I was like, really? Hope? I don't know that that's going to get us there. So this would have been 2003, 2004. I emailed Professor Snyder. So here I am sitting in a little university in the bottom of Australia, emailing the professor, telling him my ideas about how this might all work. And he FedExed to me 25 years of his published work. So I got a FedEx parcel with all his monographs in it, and just absolutely immersed myself in his work. And it made the link for me. So what hope theory does, so we have an image of the future that we've created. So if we take it down to the individual level, you know, when I grow up, I want to be X. Now, lots of us did that. When I grew up, I was going to be the first female Governor General of Australia. Well, that didn't happen.
Can we quickly ask everybody what they wanted to be when they grew up? You guys put it in the chat. What did you want to be when you grew up? I want to see it. You wanted to be the first lieutenant governor. What did you want to be, Rowena?
The first, so because we are a Commonwealth country, under the Queen, we have the Governor General that is the Queen's representative, and we'd never had a female Governor General when I was a kid, so I wanted to be the first female Governor General.
Right on. We've had botanists, teachers, dentists, obstetricians, a pilot, a veterinarian. Jeannie Whitehouse got what she wanted. She is a nerdy CPA, a scientist, an art teacher, and Michelle, wow, doing so much. Teacher, writer, actor, nurse.
Awesome.
It's a keto cooker, like the keto diet. That must be what it is. Diverse. Yes, that is what it is. Thank you, Rowena. Appreciate it. Okay, so back to hope theory. So hope.
Yes.
You're a kid. Hope.
So we've had this dream. So for some people, well, for many people, the dream is just a dream. We have a hope, we have a wish. But there are a group of people, and I've read Chris Hadfield, the Canadian astronaut's autobiography. For a group of people as children, they work out that the thing that they've decided they want to do is the thing they're going to do. And they actually create pathways and feel like they can achieve it and keep trying to achieve it. So for him, if I looked at his life story where he talked about he wanted to be an astronaut, so the first thing he worked out he needed to do was to become a pilot, and then he needed to join the military, and then he needed to get it. So each step of the way, he worked out what the thing, so he would re-goal for each step. So yes, he still had his big goal, but he broke his big goal into small goals and achieved each of those one after the other. So the fact that, you know, some of us in that list, and I'm not the first female Governor General of Australia, didn't show that we had low hope. But I think what it does indicate is that we can have ideas of the future or images of the future that we don't act on. But then there are some that are so compelling or that we desire so much that we actually start to work out how to do it. And hope theory, I guess for me, was the explanatory way in to how we do that. What's the mechanism through which that operates?
I take it you got your master's in strategic foresight, and I'm willing to bet hope was part of it.
Yes. And I started doing, so hope theory for me is one of those things that once it's in your head, it's never out. So it's actually coloured the last 20 years of my working life. So the way I do, sorry.
No, I'm sorry. I remember you telling me when we had our first true sit down chat that hope is like the central, this might not be your words, but you said something to the effect of, it is like the central organizing principle of my life.
It is.
And So that's astonishing. But when you explained how you think about it, and that's what you're going to do with these folks, like it absolutely makes sense. And so fill us with your hope. Help us use hope in a useful way, not in just a wishy, starry-eyed way.
So I've got a picture. So are you happy for me to share my screen and I'll show you, because I think a picture helps.
Yes.
So this is how hope works. So for me and Rebecca, I think the conversation you and I had was how had I used hope during, because I think I was in the first lockdown when we spoke. And so just to set the scene, first lockdown, I'd just come out of a contract. I was about to, start looking for whatever the next piece of work was. Lockdown hit, so I'm unemployed at home in a pandemic with my son, who's 19, who'd lost 3 jobs because he's on his gap year between the end of year 12 and uni. He'd set himself up for a year of working, then travel. All his jobs disappeared. He couldn't travel. So life was looking pretty dire, actually. We were very unhappy. So the application of hope to that situation and the way that I used it was to say, all right, well, we've got this period of time. What are the things that I can achieve? Now I'm going to, there's going to be some self-care involved in this. We are in the middle of a pandemic, but what's something that I could do that would make me feel better about the situation? Now I'm not saying this hope is just like, this happens to lots of people in lots of ways, but this is what I did. So the goal for me was, well, what's some ways of thinking that I could investigate that might distract me from where I am and also improve my knowledge about Indigenous ways of knowing? So that was my goal. So then when I said, well, right, well, what are the ways that I can get this goal achieved? So I went looking for Australian Indigenous ways of knowing, which is the Sand Talk book. I had a look at North American Indigenous ways of knowing. So Braining Sweetgrass was another book I read. Started listening to podcasts and webinars and reading online journals, etc. So just trying to locate ways of accessing my goal, basically. Now, why did I think I could achieve this? Well, for me, where did the agency come from is probably in that situation I was driven a bit by desperation, I have to say, but also by curiosity. I'm a very curious person. So agency can come from lots of places. In this particular scenario, that's where it came from. So hope theory would say, all right, well, your pathways thinking and your agency thinking start to interact. And that's what then gives you the momentum to start to achieve your goal. And every small goal that you achieve will, in fact, build your agency. So achieving small goals over time builds agency and pathways thinking for the next goal achievement. So hope theory says the more you achieve goals, the more you feel you will achieve them. Therefore, your hope scale, your feeling of hope goes up and your ability to think in pathways broadens. So that's, I guess, it in a nutshell.
So pathways, agency, goals, that there's this beautiful interrelationship between them. And this is like hope alive, right? This is hope alive. So pathways, I understood, especially using your example of, one of the goals that you set for yourself was to better understand Indigenous culture. And we're going to get there, everybody, because this is powerful stuff. We're going to get to use more of the cream of Rowena's churning over the last several months. But so you set this goal for yourself. I'm going to learn more about Indigenous cultures, and the pathways were the books that you were going to read, the podcasts you were going to listen to. Help me with agency. Two white women are talking to each other about being agents in their own lives.
No.
Breaking news.
I know. So where I've seen this most interestingly, the last set of work I did was in an organisation where 3 teams had a very toxic working relationship. They were suddenly then put into the same department. So they had to overcome their toxic working relationship because they're now all having to work together. So there's that relationship piece, but it had also been done to them. So the thing that I found when I went in there was that there was almost no agency as a group. So there were a bunch of individuals that could have decided to goal about Indigenous knowledge and work themselves out in that respect. But as a group of people that needed to work together, when we did the work around, well, what's getting in our way, no one felt that they had any agency in the situation because everything had been done to them. So what we did was actually learn to flex our muscles as a group to start to, I guess, rehearse what it would be like to have agency. So in this particular story, what we did was people actually started to say no. So when requests came in from other parts of the organisation they felt were irrelevant, shouldn't be done, I would support them to say no. So it's that stepping into your power, assuming, and in the situation I'm describing, there was trauma and there was upset and there was anger and there was a whole lot of emotions that needed to be worked through. But I found it absolutely fascinating that sort of three months in, the conversation we were having was an agency conversation, because that was what was missing for us. So I hear you, Rebecca, that, when you're talking about individuals, yes, there will be systemic and positional issues around accessing individual agency. But I think one of the things I've seen over the last 20 years is sometimes if you can work at the group level, you can actually then also build individual agency. So operating and learning to as a group support each other by stepping into our power can then build individuals' ability to do it for themselves in that situation.
Yeah, okay, good. So Peggy has already done it. I'm going to invite our participants to start throwing your questions about this model into the chat. Peggy's got one I'm going to ask, and I've got a follow-up. Peggy's question is agency the same thing as ownership?
So I don't think so. So agency is your ability to feel that you have the power, the momentum, the permission sometimes to enact what you believe needs to happen in a situation, which I think is different to ownership. Owning something there's a nuance there that's not it doesn't feel like, for me, the same. I guess it depends how it's language probably, but yeah, it's moving into that space of, I can do this because I have the right. Yeah. So, I mean, I think you'd be working through, depending on what the situation is, you might be working through some moral, positional, privilege, type of discussions in your own head around whether or not your agency should be enacted in a particular situation. But at its most basic, it is just that belief in your ability to maybe make a difference or maybe take, responsibility for what needs to happen.
Yeah. Joan is suggesting maybe we say your power. Jeannie is saying, okay, could it be like your authority? But what I'm thinking as you're talking, I'm thinking about some of the least privileged, most overlooked two-leggeds, and those are often kids, right? Yeah. And I think about, agency in kids. Like, kids should have the ability to say, and it's the first word they learn, no. I mean, individual results may vary, right? But agency to say no or yes or that one or not that one or So I like how you're describing it as your own, sort of giving yourself permission to be an actor in your own life, to be active in how you choose and what you choose. Linda Langston has asked, go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, I'm just looking at Linda's question. So people who don't have a sense of time or the future, how do we help them build a sense of future and therefore hope? So interestingly, a colleague of ours is in the youth justice system in the Northern Territory, where the majority of the young men in the youth detention centre are young Indigenous men. And he's working with them using hope theory and personal training to give them that sense of future and move them into feeling that they have a sense of agency and they are able to act and they are worthy, and all of those things that we know are really important for people in that situation. And he's been doing that for the last 5 to 6 years with amazing success. I mean, this guy's really incredible. So, and for him coming when he actually learned through hope through Peter Haywood and myself, but for him it gave a framework of how to, I guess, arrange his interventions and to be able to diagnose is a bit of a loaded term, but be able to see in the behaviours that were turning up in front of him where they may have needed support. You know, were they struggling with creating goals for themselves? Were they struggling with trying to work out ways to achieve those goals? Or was it actually around whether or not they believed they could achieve anything? Was that where they needed to start? So he's used it really effectively in that space. And Professor Snyder had worked a lot with kids, and a lot of his PhD students had done work with kids in this space. And Hope, there's actually a book that I used on my children when they were young, I'm sure they thank me for that, around creating hope in children.
What's the name of the book? Do you remember?
I think it's The Great Big Book of Hope, it's called.
That's awesome. So the selfish question that I want to ask, Michelle Thibault has said, I love your story about career paths, work being done on hope-centered career development that works in this way. If we get there as we're seeking employment, then we'll be there as employees and entrepreneurs. And she's put the link in there for you guys. That's awesome. Thank you, Michelle. I wanted to ask you, you know, some of what we've been talking about on these webinars is that going back to before, the snapback scenario is it's a used future, it's a recycled future. We don't want to go there. Yep. So, you know, there are some sort of big goals that some of us have around how we wish that we want society to have greater equity. And I think for all of people's very good intentions, many white people, for example, have said, I'm not sure where to start. I don't feel like I should lead these conversations. I want to be useful, but you know, the pathway seems to have been books, because every bookseller is sold out or backlisted with, you know, the most popular books. And then is the agency just fully participating, or, you know, in those book clubs, or so what would you say to a population that really wants big change, systemic change, but is not necessarily authorized to do anything, doesn't necessarily have power, as we've just talked about? How would you organize us?
So I find the power thing really interesting, because I, like many people, have always thought, well, I haven't got power. You know, somebody else has got power. Somebody else up there at the top of the tree knows much more than I do and will make really good decisions on my behalf. And then as time's gone on and I've heard and read from, you know, more and more people who get to the top of the tree. So I found Obama's reflections on his, he did an interview, it must be a few years ago now, where he reflected on his role as a civic organizer, and then when he got into wherever else, Congress, or he came through Congress, didn't he? So as a congressman, what it felt, so as a civic organizer, he felt he didn't have any power, so he went into Congress. So at Congress, he was like, right, now I'm going to have the power, and he realized he was in a system where he didn't really have any power. He had to manage a whole lot of interest groups. So then he's like, right, well, I'll get myself, you know, become the president. So then he became the president, and he realized he was in yet another system, which meant he couldn't have all the power. Again, power is shared. So then he went, all right, I'll get into the international stage. And again, so it didn't matter what level he was at, he felt that he didn't have the power. And I've heard a number of our politicians say the same thing, as they've gotten to these positions of power and they realise they haven't got any. So I find that absolutely fascinating. So I guess then where my mind went, having heard those stories, well, we actually all have the power. So then Foresights and Future Studies has a part of it where it looks at big social change patterns over millennia. And one of the things that's pretty clear over millennia is that a large group of people who just decide enough's enough have the power to change absolutely everything. Mm-hmm. So, you know, the Visigoths, the Bedouins at the gate, you know, any revolution you care to mention. But it's that dynamic of people deciding across massive groups, and it doesn't need to be violent necessarily. Mm-hmm. I mean, we have had non-violent revolutions, but it's that we just decide that it's going to be different. And I think the Black Lives Matter, I guess, tipping point that we've seen over the last few weeks shows that, you know, people have just decided all over the world. It's not just in America, you know, here as well. We've had some of the most searing conversations I've seen in my lifetime about our Indigenous history and the way things have played out here on television in ways that's never happened before. So that's a massive shift for us. So I guess I'm with you. I mean, I don't think snapbacks where anybody really, well, there probably are some people that want to go, but for, you know, most people around the world, that's not going to be acceptable. it seems nonsensical to me. Our Prime Minister last night was talking about how growth was going to get us out of our $186 billion deficit that they've just announced. Well, growth on a finite planet when we've got a carbon economy that we need to get down to zero is impossible. Like, that's impossible. So I think it's calling this stuff out and rethinking the way we do things. And I guess the way that I've done it, the way that I've felt that I've had agency, is I just keep turning up. So I keep turning up in these organisations and I keep doing
There she is again.
It's like a bad smell, really. But yeah, that's where I landed, because I think otherwise I did spend, a period of time thinking, well, this is hopeless. We're not going to get anywhere. We're all stuffed. It's all doomed. But that's not a great way to live. So that's not what I'm doing. I'm focused. I'm contributing. I'm making the small changes I can make to the people I can influence. So
yeah, that's beautiful, and I think it's also practical. And the idea of just continuing to turn up. You're right. You can't. Not you, but generally people are like, well, people are so distracted by their phones and people this and people that. You are you. You are not people. You can just do the right thing. One of my teachers, Joanna Macy, she's an ecologist and a Buddhist, and she talks about active hope.
Yes,
and
Joanna.
Oh God, Joanna, if you, man, I should try to have her on. But she, on day one of her workshop, she makes you face the shit so hard that you feel broken when you leave day one of the workshop. And then over the next 3 days, she builds you back to the place where by day 4, you're literally, if you want to, writing vows for yourself. And it does leave you in this place of, I may only be one, but I am one. And,
maybe
I will do my bit. Yeah.
As a society, we're at the end of Joanna's day one. Like 2020 so far, if you were going to design a year that gave us that experience, wouldn't you be? So we've had bushfires, we've had floods in Australia, we've now got a pandemic. You've got civil unrest on the street. Like, what else do we need to see?
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I talk about a bad smell. 2020 has been it. All kind of stank up in here. But yeah, I'll tell you one of the things that gives me incredible hope. One of my mentors, Charlie Grantham, is a PhD with a PhD in sociology, and he talked about the importance of symbols. And he said, when symbols start to fall, something new is emerging. So when the Mississippi flag changed, as the monuments have been taken down, I heard less than an hour ago that in Virginia, the first bus that was burned in Richmond at the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement, the archivists are getting a piece of that bus. They are carving some of the metal out of that bus because they are already planning archives of this moment in Virginia's history. So we are at a great turning right now. And sometimes the mess of it is when you're living through the chaos of it, we obviously don't yet have hindsight, but there are some little, some little signals out there that like something is shifting, something is significantly turning.
And I think that's a great insight, Rebecca, because one of the things that's really hit or struck me over this period was one of my loves as a teenager was medieval and Renaissance history, for whatever reason.
Good God, nerd.
I know. Well, Eleanor of Aquitaine was one of my life heroes. Like, I just think she's an amazing woman. So anyway, I digress. But one of the, obviously, is the Black Death plays a big role in that period of history. And whenever I'd read about the Black Death, it was the Black Death, lots of people died. But this period strikes me as what that must have been like to live through. And Minette Walters has written a fiction novel about, or a couple of fiction novels about a small town in the UK and what their experience of that plague would have been like. And it's when you look at it as the sweep of history, it's, Black Death, millions of people died. But you're right, the chaos and what it's like to actually live through it completely different experience.
Oh man, I live in Madison, Wisconsin now, and there were significant bombings on campus during the 1960s and that sort of cultural revolution. And I've talked with some of the historians who are still alive who documented that time period, and they said it was hell.
Yeah.
You just never knew what was going to happen next. And like, because I was like, wasn't it exciting? And they're like, I mean, it was, right? But it was also
Joan's shaking her head. She's going, no.
right. Yeah, that's right. Joan was here. She knows.
Yeah.
Or Joan, maybe you were in Pittsburgh during that time. I think you were here. So in any event, okay. So this has been a fascinating conversation. Everybody continue to put your questions in the chat if you have them for Rowena. I want you now, Rowena, if you would be so kind, toggle us forward to what you have learned reading Sand Talk. And just a caveat for those of you who have been with me through a few of these, a few weeks ago, I did causal layered analysis where you'll remember the ocean, right? So we started in the sunlight zone and we went to the twilight zone and we ended in the abyss, right? And one of our conclusions is that if we want better results, we need better guiding myths. We need better myths. We need better founding metaphors. And the thing that struck me about Tyson's book is that the metaphor and the worldview are so different than what I was raised with that he couldn't even use like the kind of English language that I'm used to. There is a song to how he writes in English that not lures you, but takes you into this different mind state so that when he's describing this worldview, you can see it, but I could never describe it to someone else. So A, thank you. And B, I think I took drugs without actually taking a drug. With that said, Sand Talk, fantastic book. Take us inside this Aboriginal view of what could be, what is possible.
So yeah, so I'm the same. I find this, and I sat down last night again to try and chunk it up so what's the way in? So I think the first thing to say is I don't want to speak for Tyson, and I don't want to speak for Indigenous knowledge because I'm neither Indigenous, I'm not Indigenous. But I think the thing he's done that's so beautiful in this is that he's acknowledged all of that. And you're quite right, Rebecca. One of the things that really struck me was how he documents his struggle using English. So the language of colonialisation, which is linear and uses lots of categorical thinking to try and describe a way of thinking that is complex, interconnected and non-categorical. And the way that he does it is by, I think it is luring, it is a siren song of stories, because as a species, we all respond beautifully to stories. And the one he starts off with is the story about the emu. So I'm going to read it rather than paraphrase it, because I think using his voice rather than mine's important in this space. So he heard this story from an elder in Perth. So Perth's a city on the western side of our continent, a long way from everyone else, basically. So Perth would have been colonised after 50 or 60 years after the east coast of Australia. And it's a large part of our continent, and there were still Indigenous tribes wandering in the northern part of Western Australia in the 40s and 50s when they went looking for iron ore. So, it's culture that's remained as intact as possible. The genocide that happened over there was pretty awful though, so they have had to overcome or try to overcome that cultural genocide. But so this elder in Perth tells a story of a meeting in which all the species sat down for a yarn to decide which one would be the custodial species for all creation. Emu made a hell of a mess, running around, showing off his speed and claiming his superiority, demanding to be boss and shouting over everyone. You can see the dark shape of Emu in the Milky Way. Kangaroo is holding him down, echidna is grasping him from behind, and the great serpent is coiled around his legs. Containing the excesses of malignant narcissists is a team effort. And this idea of emu, he winds through the book, because his diagnosis of a lot of Western civilization is that we spend far too much time and energy on narcissists, and Australian Indigenous civilization, which has been on, we think, here for at least 60,000 years, maybe closer to 120,000 years, had learned a long time ago that it takes a community effort to manage the narcissist. So narcissists, as he says, are within all of us. Like, we all have the ability to be idiots. So he's saying it's part of the human condition, but it's up to society to create itself in such a way that the kangaroo and the echidna and the serpent manage this part of our personality. And I find it fascinating that so that's his way in. And what was interesting about that was he starts to talk about personal responsibility, individualism, civilization as actually the problem. Because what we're not doing is seeing our interconnection with the earth on which we live. So where Indigenous thinking starts is it is a co-evolving, co-evolutionary, complex, networked relationship with the ecology. So his advice, to your point, Rebecca, about what does the future look like, his advice is that we need as much diversity in our species as we can manage, and we need to match our diversity in our species to the diversity of our ecosystems and live in harmony with our ecosystems. All of which is easy to say, but extremely difficult to do from where we are today. But I find it so interesting because if you start from that point, so if, as Rebecca said, if we're in the abyss and the metaphor is interconnected, co-evolving systems, what does that bring us up to in terms of how we operate day to day? How, what are the things we create as we move up the layers into the sunlight? And what are the behaviours that then become really important versus the ones we have today? So that for me, and then when I read Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Kimmerer, which is a Native American bird, she talks about the same stuff. It's all the same stuff. So where he's got ants, larvae and butterflies as being three interconnected species and shows how they can, she's got maize, corn and pumpkins maybe. There's three, so again, the three interconnected species. So it's just, I just love it. Like, it's like, yep, I can understand how that shifts your thinking. So now I'm reading everything I can find about coevolution. So I'm reading about fungi. I'm reading about trees.
You're going to get to the top of that tree yet, girl.
So I'm just trying to work out what that means. So I'm in the midst of this. So I don't have any, I guess, pearls of wisdom that I've distilled yet from the mess. But there's something really powerful in that, because we hear it too when I hear the agile. So when you talk about agile development or networked organisations or adaptive leadership, they're all coming from the same place. It's all the same complexity, ideas of complexity and managing within complexity and intervening in systems and all of those ways of knowing that we've been playing with for the last 30 or 40 years. They're all the same stuff. And yet it's echoed in wisdom that's 100,000 years old. And that's extraordinary.
So now I'm going to do a little share screen now, because I'm trying to ball hog from you, but I think we're co-creating together, right? So
absolutely.
Apologies to those of you who are on the CLA webinar I did, and also to my futurist campers, because you just got hit over the head with this like a lot last week. But what we're talking about here, when Rowena and I are like blathering on about myth and metaphor, the way that my designer Dave and I have rethought of the CLA used to be this iceberg metaphor, which I don't love. This is I think this is way more beautiful. And as somebody from Melbourne, you're probably love this even more as well, right? So the idea is that if causal layered analysis is that there are 4 layers of how to think about society, a system, right? So the sunlight zone, where things are pretty easy to see. Then there's the twilight zone, really densely populated. A lot of the food is there, right? It's where we start to really see, oh, this is what makes the ocean tick. Then you've got that midnight zone, right? And there are some scary animals that live in that midnight zone that are from forever ago, and then there's that super cold abyss, which some people have said is it 7 or 17 Grand Canyons deep. So these are the layers, right, that are kind of like the easily understood. Okay, let's think about the ocean now. If we go forward and we apply this to society, this is where Rowena and I are kind of talking about, like, at the top, we're talking about the problems, like, oh, we've got, in the US, we've got shitty public health, and we're having terrible outcomes for Black and brown people in the US, and we're documenting sort of these problems, but these problems are relatively well known. You go to the next layer underneath that, okay, well, what causes that? What causes inequality in health outcomes? What are the policies, the procedures, the things we have chosen to do or not do, fund or not fund? Those are the things that underlie the problems that are so easy to see, right? And then you get down to the worldview. Well, there is some kind of a worldview that is enabling these policies and procedures, and, you know, sort of systemic realities that are in turn enabling the problems on top. And then finally, at the very bottom, you get to metaphor and myth. And to your point, Rowena, as you've talked about the indigenous of Australia and talking about the First Nations and Native Americans in the United States, 2 years ago at Futurist Camp, we had our first camper who represented the Ho-Chunk, the big voice people of Wisconsin. He's from Wisconsin, but they're Wisconsin, Minnesota, Illinois. They're a huge group of Native Americans here. And Eric told us, you know, because we were using CLA and we were applying it to something like the opioid epidemic, right? So we were saying, all right, the problem at the top is the opioid epidemic. What are the causes underneath that? What worldview? And then what is the metaphor and myth? And then we did a round where we chose a completely different myth and said, then what would the outcomes be? And Eric said, well, you know, the people of the big voice, the Ho-Chunk, the organizing myth, he didn't say co-creation, codependence, interdependence, but he said, you know, we're one thing here. You know, these trees and frogs are my sisters and brothers. And in my way of seeing the world, our organizing myth is it's one thing and we just have different jobs. So he's like, I'm Bear Clan, I'm responsible for protection, right? So that's my job. Other clans have other jobs. But you could just see the, you know, the other students just get blown back, and then the fun they had in building up, all right, well, if that was our organizing myth, what would the worldview be? And then what would the systems be? And then what would the outcomes be? And not to paint like just a disgustingly rosy picture or to be, you know, blinded by, you know, the reality, but the thought experiment was fantastic.
Well, and Linda's just referenced Kate Raworth's book about donut economics, which is a great example of changing the base metaphor and coming up with a different outcome. So there's an economic system we could use that's based on the boundary conditions of the planet that we occupy. Fantastic. So it's totally possible to, once you, so Peter and I did some work in a rural community out back of Victoria, and they were trying to come up with a future for themselves for the next 10 years. And so we did CLA with them as well, as you described, Rebecca. And the group that I was facilitating, so we had them in 3 groups, and each group needed to come up with a new metaphor. And it's difficult to come up with a metaphor. You actually need to keep talking. And until you hit something, and you know when you hit it, because everyone has a reaction to it. So they were talking and talking and talking. And one of the younger people in the group mentioned a marsupial, whose name I've forgotten, but a small mammal that lives very locally to their area and has a particular set of behaviours. But as soon as she mentioned this animal's name, everybody responded. That was the metaphor. So it was just absolutely fascinating to see how quickly that shifted them from this circular conversation where they went round and round and round to, right, that's our future and this is how it's going to look. And so it's an unlocking process as well, which, you know, to take it back to Tyson's work, I think that's what he's trying to do. He's offering us up what he says is child level. It's, you know, this isn't complex wisdom of the elders. He's giving us the child's version because that's all he's able to do and all we're ready to receive. but even that's extraordinary. So imagine what would happen if we created our own ways of knowing and our own wisdoms around this stuff, how that would look. So,
yeah. Oh, this is so rich. You know, when you mentioned that Tyson delivers this child level, I was so aware in reading his lyricism of how simple these concepts were and how dumb I felt for never having considered them before. So he did a very nice job. You know, Peter Hayward, your colleague and a friend of this Futures Friday series and of Futurist Camp, he gave a great example when he was on the webcast a few months ago, when he said, like, because we talked about the bushfires and then COVID, right? So it's like, jeepers, Australia cannot catch a break. And he said that one of the things that the Aboriginal people talk about is living with fire. He said, versus, you know, our colonial mindset where we have to conquer fire, right? Where we must, you know, manage fire. It's a very different thing to live with something, to say it's going to happen, versus to say it must never happen.
That's right. So one of the things that's been fascinating over the last probably decade is we've come to the realization that Aboriginal and Indigenous and First Nations people in Australia manage the landscape. So we've known this for generations, but it's only become, I guess, socially acceptable now to really talk about it. But that they manage the landscape in such a way. So a lot of early paintings of early Australia look like England. And when I was going through school, the story we were told was that was because painters came over from England, painted the landscape to make it look like England so that people were attracted to come. That was, you know, it was a perspective story, a story of how artists take the perspective of home and apply it to where they are to make it more acceptable. And that in fact, when people had got to Australia, they were horrified by the landscapes that they found because they were so different and they were alien, and so they made them make them look like England. Well, it turns out now that more work's been done, that in fact the landscapes of Australia look like England because the First Nations people were farming them. So they were keeping great swathes of bush at bay using low levels of fire in order to allow our grazing animals like our kangaroos and emus to give them places to go to make them easy to catch. Like, yeah, so they've been managing this landscape for 60 to 100,000 years. And when we got here, we didn't have a clue what we were seeing. So what we've done for the last, you know, as the colonial settlers for the last 200 years is not burn things, because no one likes to burn things. So these catastrophic bushfires we've had over the last summer, would never have happened, you know, in 1,000 years beforehand, because the Indigenous people had worked out how to live within the boundaries of the landscape that we inhabit. So, you know, this low-level fire burning, which they do now all over the Northern Territory, they've got Indigenous and First Nations people doing this burning management of our northern parts, means that it's so it's that really orange flame, and it just takes out the grass and I guess takes the bottom layers of all the shrubs, which means you don't get these really high intensity fires that then take out all the canopy and completely ruin our, you know, dry forests. So it's about managing within that. And a friend of mine runs our Bushfire Cooperative Research Centre, and they've been looking into traditional fire stick methods of managing our bush and forest assets. So it's starting to make its way in, thank goodness, finally. But it's taken us a long time to get over ourselves to actually value the wisdom of those that have come before us. You know, in our country, Aboriginal people were still seen as flora and fauna until 1967. So, you know, we've got a long way to go in terms of working ourselves through this process. But there's so much, you know, people survived on this continent, which was probably the driest continent in the world, they think, during the last ice age. People survived here. So they've got stories to tell us about how to survive the coming climate emergency, or the one we're already in. And I think we need to be listening to them. So I guess, you know, I'm trying, like you, Rebecca, I'm trying to tune I've got a colleague, Joe Voris, who says, you know, you need to tune your receiver to what's being generated at you. So I'm trying to tune my receiver and train my brain to hear and see and recognise different patterns through doing this work, so that when information comes at me, I've got a way of hooking it in to my brain. I can recognise it and start to, you know, bring it into how I think.
Our futurist campers are so sick of me talking about, well, I'm assuming they are so sick of me talking about being good sensors. And that's exactly it, right?
Yes.
How do you turn your radar on in a way that you can hear what's happening and not just be blinded by your biases, you know, that we've learned over time. Rowena, I want to come back to the chat real quick, see if there are any new questions. But if we don't have new questions right now, I wonder if you could walk. I feel embarrassed that I have never brought the Futures Triangle to this audience. I know, I can't even believe I can still have APF behind my name. But I wonder if you might share the Futures Triangle.
I would love to. So when Rebecca and I touched base about what this might look like this hour, I said, oh, we were talking about this and that. And I said, oh, the Futures Triangle, it's my all-time favourite tool. And then she outed herself, as she just has now, that she's never shown it to. So this is one of those beautifully simple tools that is just absolutely incredibly powerful. So it's literally a triangle, which is supposed to I guess, represent the future. So any future you or a group are trying to bring about. So a future has three parts to it. It has the weight, so the things that continue, the history on which it's based, barriers to change, the belief systems and worldviews of the people involved in that future, both internally and the systems that they're in. It has the push of the present, which talks about the processes of change, you know, technological, economic, demographic, social, environmental, all the things we know and experience on a day-to-day basis. And then it's got the pull of the future. So what are the images of the future? What are the intentions, goals, plans, dreams, hopes? What are the things we want to drive towards? And what the Futures Triangle does is ask you to consider these three aspects of creating any future. And in any given group, it's usually, I've used it in a group situation more often than not. In any given group, the weight, the push or the pull will have a different resonance or drive around it. So for some groups that are deep in the history of trauma and pain, the pull will be the thing that they absolutely want to focus on. They want an image that will drive them out into some sort of new great future that'll be different from the past. For some organisations or groups, it might be that the present is just so overwhelming, they're being pulled in 25 different directions, that they need to go back to the past and see how they've dealt with that before in order to create the future. So the three aspects really interact with each other. There are questions that go with these things. So with the weight, when we're talking about creating the future, we talk about, well, what will we leave behind? So what are the things that up until this point have served us really well but won't help us moving forward? And what are they and how will we leave them behind? And what will we bring with us? So what are the things that we value, the legacies that we'll bring forward? If it's an organisation, what are the things we've been really good at that we want to keep with us? Questions about the push, or what are the things that are going on in the systems in which we operate that we can use to move us forward? And what are the things that we want to resist? And the kicker to that one is, where are we going to find the energy to do so? Because the other thing this triangle talks about is where energy goes, so where effort's spent. Because any organisation, group or system only has enough, a certain amount of energy, and you need to portion it out across these three areas. And then the pull is what innovations do we need to create? And sorry, that wasn't well done, was it? What innovations do we need to create to bring us into the future? So they're the 5 questions. So the way this works as a tool for me is I use it in group settings, and we usually, so for most organisations in Western countries, my observation would be, having worked internationally with this, that they want to start with what innovations do we need to create, then work out how to navigate the present, and then pretend the past doesn't exist.
Exactly. Like, what weight? We know of no weight.
So given that's our tendency, where I tend to start is with the weight. And usually what I'll do is look for what will we bring with us. So start with the positive. What are the really good things that we're proud of that we want to move forward? But also be, I guess, pretty hardcore about getting them to identify what they're going to leave behind. Because the leaving behind, the creating of space, gives us some energy or some ability to focus on, when we get to the push questions, where we're going to find the energy to resist what we need to resist. So I go from weight to pull usually. So, you know, what are we proud of? What are we going to keep with us? What are we going to leave behind? Right. What's the future we want to create? So that happens. And then we talk about, all right, well, what are we facing into at the moment? What are the things that we've got going on that we can either use to help us get where we want to go, or that we have to do something about? So that's, I guess, the intersection of those things. And that's the triangle.
This is it. Sorry, guys. We were just burying a headline for you, kind of leaving a little Easter egg in the First Fridays series for you. So, Rowena, when you start with weight, do you find that people get bogged down in that?
It depends. It depends what's been going on. So I've noticed in a lot of not-for-profit and community groups, sometimes the what we'll leave behind question's really hard, because what they've gained, what they've achieved has been really hard fought often and won at great cost. So they're not willing sometimes to leave things behind. For-profit companies, well, you know, companies seem to find that much easier. Like they're much more, I guess, attuned to reinventing themselves. But yeah, for especially because I work a lot in that not-for-profit community space, especially for community groups that have been set up for a reason that they've found then they needed to pivot, letting go of that reason or working out how to reform that metaphor, if we take the CLA approach, can be difficult. So yes, it can get bogged down, but it's a really important conversation to have. So where we used to start, when we first started using this tool, Peter and I, we'd start with pull, and then we go to push and say, all right, well, if that's where, so which is the sort of McKinsey model of, you know, here's where you want to go, here's all the things you need to navigate. Now we'll sort of, you know, at the end of the workshop at 4:55, when you're finishing at 5 o'clock, you'll do the things that get in the way. And then we couldn't work out, well, why is this not going anywhere? So I guess it was a needs must as well, was learning, you know, sometimes the things you need to face. And when I look at the Keegan work on immunity to change that's making its way around the leadership space at the moment on an individual level, it's the same thing. What are the things that I need to reflect on in myself that stop me from achieving what I want to achieve? What do I want to keep with me and what do I want to put down? So this Futures Triangle asks the same sorts of questions, but at an organisational or group level.
This is such a great place to actually begin to wind this down, especially to just kind of give some love to my futurist campers who are on the call here. Every year, Rowena, about half of our futurist campers choose themselves as their domain. They're in transition of some kind. They want to figure out where they're going in the future. And the power of this question, you know, what will I leave behind? What will I carry with me? It's a powerful question at an individual level and certainly at a group level, as you've discussed. We have one question, and then I'm going to put a challenge out to our audience while I tee up the question. So for the audience, could you, in a word or phrase, express to Rowena in the chat what you've taken from this, like a concept that you've taken, an insight that you've taken from this? And then the question is from Peggy. She said, this is a tangent, it doesn't necessarily have to be addressed, but do hope theory and the Stockdale Paradox intersect?
So I don't think I know what the Stockdale Paradox is.
Take yourself off mute, Peggy. What is it?
Well, it's a thing out of Jim, Collins's work, and it's based on Admiral Stockdale, who was a POW in Vietnam, and he was I guess the most senior POW anyway. And as he came out of it, he said the people who survived as POWs always had hope, but they weren't stuck on, and the ones who didn't had hope around a specific date. For example, the ones who had trouble surviving were like, we're going to be out of this camp by Christmas. Well, Christmas came and it didn't happen. Whereas he said he always had maintained hope and the goal, or whatever you want to call that he was in fact going to get out, and worked towards that, but not sticking it on some specific event that had to happen to force that to happen. I think that's a real short explanation of, and I hope it's right.
No, I think you're right, because I've heard a similar story from the Viktor Frankl work out of the concentration camps in the Second World War. It was a similar thing. People who attached to a particular milestone point in time really found, when that milestone was passed, they passed. You know, they couldn't hold on. So I think Snyder's work would say that having that higher level in longer term goal without re-goaling into the smaller, shorter term. So he probably did, like Stockdale sounds like just to survive, he would have had to have kept himself going in some way, shape or form. So I'd say it's the same dynamic. I'd be interested to understand though what that attachment to outcome did. So, you know, whether the attachment to the short-term goal can actually get in the way of the bigger term, longer term. And there'd be some work in there, I think, in the hope space that would have addressed that. I haven't come across it because it's not been something I've looked at. So yeah, I'd be interested for my own knowledge to understand what that dynamic would look like, because you'd imagine that there has been some work around, especially young people goaling up too much. So, you know, rather than someone who's got, who hasn't finished school, who's not employed, says, you know, I want to be a university professor, they get unrealistic goals. So there's been a bit of work around that unrealistic goal setting. So maybe the dynamic that we saw in the concentration camps, both in Vietnam War and Second War, was more, using Snyder's perspective, is more in that unrealistic goal setting. But I don't know how you'd know that in advance, you know? So yeah, that's interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, Peggy, that was a great question. I've got some. The question to me is like, what is the agency in that example of the Holocaust? There's so little agency. Like the only thing you can choose basically is your attitude. So anyway, but I'm sure that if Rowena sets her sight on understanding this, she will obtain 25 years of research on it, synthesize it, and we'll have her back on a show. Rowena, check out the insights.
Oh, wow.
Linda
Awesome.
Langston is looking for a new metaphor. Jeannie Whitehouse is gonna, she's downloaded that Sandtalk book on her Kindle already. Leslie Wright, that futures triangle as a framework for how to engage people. John Warren, future triangle and the ocean, the triangle. Stephen Thomason said, thanks for a workable version of hope theory.
Fantastic.
Nice work. Nice work. Michelle, the connections between hope and agency. You kicked ass, Rowena.
That's awesome. Thanks, guys. That was really great. Thank you for the opportunity. Thanks, Rebecca. You made that very easy. That was fantastic.
You are a delight. Thank you so much. And everybody have a great day, night, weekend, whatever it is. We'll see you next Friday. Next Friday, by the way, is The Future of American Democracy with Jonathan Peck. I just did the preview with him today. He blew my mind, and I've been thinking about this for a while. So hope to see you next Friday, July 31st. All right, Rowena.
That's awesome.
Have a good Friday. Talk to you later. Bye, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Our pleasure, John. You bet.
Great to see you. Bye.
Same here.
You too.
Bye, everybody.